Robert Baratheon's hammer was not always so famed, not always so burdened by the whispers of sorcery and hidden power that would echo throughout the Seven Kingdoms in the years after the rebellion. The story of that hammer did not begin at the trident where Rhaegar Targaryen's rubies scattered into the rushing waters, nor at the walls of Summerhall where Robert learned to heft a simpler, cruder weapon as a boy. It began in a time before the rebellion, in a hush of secrecy that would later be overshadowed by war and heartbreak and the forging of a new realm. Yet in that hush, in the far corners of Storm's End, a blacksmith named Harbert the Silent, or so the tales say, worked in the pre-dawn hours to craft something extraordinary for the young Lord Robert. In the Stormlands, the wind and rain were eternal companions. Storm's End itself had been built by the might of the Durrandon kings to withstand ceaseless tempests, and that ancient fortress had never fallen to storm nor siege. The Baratheons, who claimed descent from the Storm Kings, carried something of that tempest within them. Robert, even in his youth, had the roiling spirit of a thundercloud. He was broad of shoulder, quick to laugh but quicker to anger, and his appetite for life was as endless as the gusts that whipped the coasts of Shipbreaker Bay. With his father's passing and the responsibilities of lordship thrust upon him earlier than expected, Robert found solace in the training yard, in the clash of steel, in the slam of his fist on oak. He wanted a warhammer rather than a sword, for he had once seen a statue of the Durrandon king, who had wielded a great hammer to shatter the helms of his enemies. From that day, he felt drawn to the blunt yet brutal finality of a hammer's strike. Harbert the Silent was a blacksmith said to come from a line that traced its roots back to the Age of Heroes. He was no common smith, nor was he a man prone to idle chatter. The story went that his mother had been from the island of Estermont and his father from the mountainous border of Dorne, giving him a swarthy complexion and a measured precision in his craft. He rarely spoke. His voice emerged only to name the price of his wares or to utter a muttered curse when the coals in the forge died out prematurely. It was said that what Harbert lacked in loquacity, he made up for in a private devotion to the old ways, or to some secret knowledge passed down from obscure ancestors. On nights of the new moon, he would vanish from Storm's End and return only at dawn, sweat-soaked and with a wild cast to his eyes, as though he had glimpsed truths hidden from lesser men. When the young Lord Baratheon demanded a hammer worthy of his station, of his formidable build, and of his legacy, Harbert set to work. For weeks he labored in the forges below the castle, feeding the flames with special charcoal said to be infused with pine and something rarer, gleaned from the deep forests near Tarth. Soldiers, knights, and visiting lords sometimes heard strange chanting, carried on the wind from the lower halls late at night, but no one dared to question Harbert. In the hush, the smith hammered and shaped, seeking not merely the right balance of steel but something intangible, something that might resonate with the storms that battered the fortress overhead. Robert was not patient. He visited the forge daily, though Harbert refused him entry. The youth saw nothing but closed doors. He heard the ring of metal upon metal. Sometimes he heard a low chanting, or thought he did, and his imagination ran wild with possibilities. His friend Ned Stark was visiting from the north at the time, and the two would share cups of ale in the great hall. Ned, quiet and dutiful even then, expressed mild concern at these rumors of chanting. But Robert would guffaw and say, "Let the old man pray if he likes. As long as my hammer is strong enough to crack a skull, it's good enough for me." Then the day came when Harbert emerged pale and sweating, the new hammer cradled in his massive arms. The weapon was far heavier than any standard warhammer, the steel head broad and dark, as if it absorbed rather than reflected the flickering torchlight. The haft was wrapped in thick leather for better grip, the top end adorned with subtle runes or markings that no one could decipher. Robert seized it in his hand, testing its weight with a gleam in his eyes. He laughed, loud and hearty, proclaiming this was the very thing he wanted. Harbert merely nodded, as if his life's work had reached some culminating moment. That night, Ned would admit to Robert that the hammer made the hairs on his neck prickle, that it felt as if a shadow clung to it. Robert laughed again and told him not to be daft. A hammer was a hammer, steel was steel, and if men felt a chill, it was the wind from Shipbreaker Bay. Yet the question would echo in the years to come, growing louder after the rebellion and whispered even more after Robert ascended the Iron Throne. Was that hammer merely steel, or was it something more? Though Storm's End was a place of tradition, Robert was as brash as any young lord with a new toy. He quickly tested the warhammer's might in the yard, shattering wooden practice dummies and bending shields of lesser steel. He won every friendly match he fought with it, though the knights of his household did not truly dare to match blows against their young lord with all their strength. The difference was plain to see. Robert fought as if possessed by a singular confidence, a belief that once he lifted the hammer, no force could stand against him. If he won, it was because he was Robert, strong, fearless, and agile for a man of his size. And if the hammer held any secrets, no one found them in that summer of training sessions. It was just a rumor, a hush, a fleeting question. Why was it that when that steel head crashed down upon a target, men swore they saw sparks of strange color or felt a pressure in the air, as if thunder had rolled through the courtyard? The old maester at Storm's End tried to examine the hammer one evening. Robert was away in the hall, feasting. The maester, stooped with age, reached for the weapon's haft. The moment his fingers brushed the leather wrappings, he felt a jolt course up his arm. Startled, the old man recoiled, nearly toppling into the anvil. He later told no one of the incident but recorded in a private journal. Steel should not vibrate when not in motion. There is a presence here I cannot explain. That night, the maester could not sleep. The next day, he avoided the forge and the training yard, content to remain in his tower, puzzling over knowledge gleaned from ancient texts that spoke of runes and sigils, though none matched the faint markings on Robert's hammer. Meanwhile, Robert wore his new warhammer on his belt as often as he could, with all the pride of a youth sporting a sign of power and manhood. Ned Stark departed for the Vale to continue his fostering with Jon Arryn, and Robert soon followed. He took the hammer with him, for no man would question him traveling with a favored weapon, though in the Vale swords were more common. To many knights, a warhammer was a brutish tool, less refined than a blade or spear. Robert cared little. He found that as the days passed, the heft of it became familiar, as if it had always been at his side. It was during those early years that he learned to use its weight to break shields and be the unstoppable force in any sparring match. His prowess grew, and so did his legend, until the fateful days of suspicion and rebellion dawned. When Prince Rhaegar Targaryen crowned Lyanna Stark as the Queen of Love and Beauty at Harrenhal, Robert's heart had brimmed with confusion, jealousy, and rage. Though the politics of that gesture were tangled in Targaryen intrigue, Robert only saw the insult to his betrothal and the slight to his pride. Whispers spread that Rhaegar's choice was more than a whim, that he harbored genuine feelings for Lyanna or had some secret plan that would shake the realm. But Robert, true to his nature, boiled the matter down to simpler terms. The Silver Prince had slighted him, and that was enough. He returned to the Vale fuming, hammer in hand, eager for a chance to prove himself against the Targaryen. Yet the chance would come in darker circumstances than a tourney field. While rumors abounded that Rhaegar had absconded with Lyanna, the realm grew uneasy. King Aerys sat the Iron Throne in madness, and unrest simmered in the Stormlands and beyond. Robert's friendship with Ned Stark deepened, and the bond with Jon Arryn solidified in the face of a tyrant's demands. When the call came from King's Landing that the heads of Robert and Ned be delivered for their suspected treasonous hearts, the seeds of rebellion were sown. Robert returned to Storm's End, hammered out alliances, and prepared for war. In those war councils, older lords with graying beards insisted on caution, on forging alliances quietly, on gathering men. But Robert was a force of nature, eager to ride out, to meet the foe, to challenge Rhaegar or any Targaryen loyalist who dared stand against him. His hammer, no longer a mere symbol of youthful pride, seemed to embolden him further. If the lords of the Stormlands felt any sense of dread emanating from that weapon, they could not deny its devastating potential in their lord's powerful hands. Battles erupted across the Seven Kingdoms. In the early skirmishes, Robert was unstoppable. Men would speak of how he crushed enemy lines with the swing of that hammer, how one blow could break the best steel in half, how shields snapped like kindling. Some knights, men of logic and reason, ascribed it all to Robert's sheer strength. He was, after all, towering and muscled, with the kind of raw physical prowess that not even Rhaegar, refined and graceful though he was, could match in a direct confrontation. Still, rumors grew. Soldiers claimed that lightning flashed on clear days whenever Robert swung his hammer. They whispered that the storms of the Stormlands themselves fought beside him. The men who faced him on the battlefield felt the ground quake beneath their feet, as if a hidden thunder sounded from the weapon's impact. Could that all be the fever dream of war? Or was there something more? As the rebellion swept through the Crownlands, the Reach, and the Riverlands, Robert's reputation ballooned into legend. Songs were sung of the Storm Lord's hammer, how it rang like a thunderclap. Word reached the Targaryen loyalists of a warrior who seemed unstoppable, a man who struck with the fury of the old gods or the new. Rhaegar Targaryen, burdened by his own prophecies and desires, prepared to meet this new challenge. By the time the two armies converged at the Trident, the lines were drawn between prophecy and wrath, between a crown prince who saw visions of a chosen one and a furious young lord who had lost the woman he loved, or believed he loved, and who carried a weapon that might have been more than mortal steel. The day of the Battle of the Trident dawned gray, the sky heavy with cloud, the promise of rain in the air. Rhaegar's forces and Robert's rebels clashed in a terrible storm of steel. War cries rent the air, and the waters of the river turned red with blood. Upon a rise not far from the ford, Robert sat atop his warhorse, hammer in hand. He wore no elaborate sigil upon his chest, only the crowned stag of House Baratheon, proud and unblemished. The damp wind teased the banners, and the prince's dragon standard snapped across the field in challenge. It was said that when Robert kicked his horse to a gallop, thunder rumbled across the skies. Then came the fateful clash of Robert and Rhaegar. The Silver Prince was everything a warrior king should be. Elegant in his armor, deadly with a long sword, and driven by a sense of destiny that he believed was etched in the stars. Robert, though, was the unstoppable boulder tumbling downhill, the avalanche that cared nothing for prophecy. He swung his hammer with raw and brutal efficiency. The clang of their initial meeting rang across the river. Soldiers paused in their own struggles to watch, at least until the tide of battle swept them away again. Each time Rhaegar's sword slashed at Robert, the younger man seemed to shrug off the blow, battered but determined. With each answering strike of that hammer, sparks flew in a way that few had ever witnessed. It was as if the steel head crashed not just against armor, but against the very essence of the Dragon Prince. When Robert struck Rhaegar square in the chest, the blow was so mighty that witnesses said it echoed like a clap of thunder. Rhaegar's rubies scattered into the current, glimmering red as they sank beneath the blood-tinged waters. The prince collapsed into the shallows, his armor caved in. Robert's hammer was drenched with blood and battered from the collision, yet it remained intact, like something forged for devastation. There were those who stood close enough to see a faint glow, or so they claimed, that pulsed along the runes etched upon the steel head. Others swore they felt a crackle in the air, like the remnants of lightning. But in the tide of war, who could say what was real, what was fevered imagination, and what was the manifestation of true magic? Thus fell Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, and thus was the outcome of the rebellion largely sealed in that single, unforgettable moment. The realm turned, and Robert Baratheon, crowned in the hearts of his men by that victory, marched onward to King's Landing. The city fell, and the dynasty of the dragons collapsed into ashes. Still, the question lingered. Had Robert triumphed solely by virtue of his formidable strength, or had that warhammer, courtesy of Harbert the Silent, carried some deep, arcane power? In the early days of his kingship, Robert rarely parted from his hammer. He had it displayed in the Red Keep, near his throne, a silent warning to any who might plot against him. Over time, as his belly grew and his interest in the daily tasks of rule waned, the hammer saw less and less use. He took to hunting boars in the Kingswood with a spear rather than a heavy hammer that had begun to feel cumbersome in his idle state. Yet the hammer remained in the castle, carefully watched by the Kingsguard, or so they said, with more vigilance than one might expect for a mere relic of war. Some nights, servants whispered, the new moon would bring a faint resonance from the place where the hammer was stored, like a distant hum or the heartbeat of a slumbering beast. After Robert had children, the business of kingship consumed him, along with wine, feasts, and tourneys. The hammer remained, collecting dust, but still regarded with a mixture of awe and unease. No matter how many times the king drunkenly bragged about how he caved in Rhaegar's chest, there was always a hush when the hammer was mentioned. Tales spread that the forging had been done with knowledge beyond mortal ken, that the storms of the Stormlands had poured some essence into the metal. Others said it was cursed with the Targaryen blood that it had spilled, that something of the dragon's spirit lingered, waiting for a chance to strike back at the man who had undone their line. Certainly, Robert himself never dwelled on such questions. He was too busy living, feasting, and drowning out the ghosts of the past with ale and laughter. Yet in the Red Keep, in hidden corners, a new generation of maesters and inquisitive minds studied the old annals. Some believed that in forging the hammer, Harbert the Silent had invoked ancient runes akin to those used in the creation of Valyrian steel. But this was no Valyrian steel, for that was the domain of the freehold sorceries, lost in the doom. Whatever technique Harbert had employed was older still, something from the darkest forests, from the legends of the children of the forest or the worship of the old gods. Perhaps even some whispered knowledge gleaned from the strange sea stones that dotted the coasts. If there was a secret, Harbert had taken it to his grave, vanishing soon after Robert marched to war, never to be seen again. Some claimed he returned to the Stormlands. Others said he was spirited away by a faceless group of sorcerers who guarded such secrets. The truth died unspoken, just as Robert's hammer found a quiet resting place in the Red Keep's armory. Time wore on. Robert's rule continued, marked by debts, hunts, and the occasional flare of the temper that had once made him unstoppable on the battlefield. But as his belly grew and his strength waned, the memory of the unstoppable Storm Lord began to fade into myth. People recalled the rebellion with patriotic pride, yet new intrigues filled the capital's corridors, new alliances formed, and new threats loomed. The warhammer that slew Rhaegar Targaryen sat in silent witness to the passing years. Robert rarely touched it. On some nights, he would wander to the armory in a drunken stupor, staring at it with eyes full of old glories and old regrets, perhaps remembering the rush of the Trident's waters or the scattered rubies floating away. Sometimes, the guards heard him mutter, "Could I still lift you now?" before staggering away, shaking his head. What power might that hammer still hold, unused and perhaps resentful of its abandonment? Or was all of it mere rumor spun into tall tales by men longing to ascribe the intangible to the brutal realities of war? The day came when Robert set out on his final hunt, the boar spear in his hand, leaving the hammer behind. The tragedies that followed, his mortal wounding, the succession crisis, again cast the hammer in the background, overshadowed by the clash of ambition among the great houses. When Robert died, the question of the hammer's fate was overshadowed by the question of who would sit the Iron Throne. Yet if there was any lingering spark of its rumored magic, it sat in dark corners, waiting. In the year following Robert's death, as the War of the Five Kings erupted, rumors abounded that Joffrey, the new and ill-tempered boy king, had ordered the warhammer locked away or destroyed. Others whispered that it was lost in the chaos, or stolen by a knight who hoped to harness its legendary power. Occasionally, a drunken sellsword in Flea Bottom would boast of having glimpsed it in the Red Keep, or that he had once felt its weight, or that it was hidden under the bed of the king. The stories circulated but were never confirmed. The hammer, if it still held any eldritch property, remained silent. Still, the question remains among maesters, knights, and curious souls. Did Robert Baratheon's hammer bear a trace of the old magic? Had it truly drawn upon the storms of the Stormlands, or fed upon some ancient energy invoked by the blacksmith's runes? Or was Robert simply the greatest warrior of his age, possessed of a raw physical power that few could match? The truth lies in the realm of legend, in the gap between what men can see and what they only suspect. History remembers only that Robert Baratheon slew Rhaegar Targaryen with a warhammer blow that seemed to echo across the Seven Kingdoms. It does not record the intangible hum of power, nor the hush that fell over the battlefield when the hammer met its mark. Yet if one listens closely, in the corners of taverns and the hush of the maester's libraries, one can still hear the question. Could Robert Baratheon's hammer have been more than forged steel? Could it have been the deciding factor in the fate of a realm, channeling a hidden storm that no one dared name? And if so, does that power still lie dormant, waiting for another strong arm and a furious heart to claim it and unleash it once more? Time, as ever, marches on, weaving truths and lies into the tapestry of history, leaving it to dreamers and scholars to wonder what truly happened on the day the dragon fell to the stag and his hammer of thunder. The first time young Tommen Baratheon dared to approach his late father's warhammer, he was no more than a boy of 8, still unsteady on his feet in the training yard. Though Tommen had only the faintest memories of Robert as a towering figure who ruffled his hair and laughed heartily, he felt an inexplicable pull to the weapon locked away in a shadowed chamber of the Red Keep. The caretaker, an old knight with creaking joints, had told him stories of how the hammer had ended Rhaegar Targaryen's life at the Trident, how the blow was so mighty that rubies scattered for leagues. Tommen's wide eyes sparkled with awe and terror. He knew the legends but had never seen the weapon up close. When the caretaker dozed off during a lazy afternoon, Tommen crept away from his lessons with the septa and slipped into the armory. Dust motes floated in the streams of sunlight cutting through the high windows. Row upon row of swords, spears, and crossbows lined the walls, but he moved past them. He walked deeper, toward a far corner behind a pair of battered old shields. There, perched on a wooden stand and covered with a tattered cloth, lay his father's famed hammer. With trembling hands, Tommen lifted the cloth. The steel glinted darkly, reflecting shadows rather than light. The haft was thicker than the boy's arms, the runic markings along its surface barely visible unless one looked closely. They seemed to shift when the eye lingered, as though beckoning him closer. Tommen reached out. He did not dare touch the steel head. Something in the back of his mind warned him away, but he let his fingers graze the leather-bound haft. Immediately, a subtle quiver ran through his arm, a fleeting warmth or a tiny current, like static. He gasped, pulling back. Had the old knight's stories planted the sensation in his imagination, or was there truly something stirring within the hammer? Stumbling back a step, Tommen felt tears pricking his eyes from an emotion he could not name. It was like a deep, echoing loneliness emanating from the metal itself, as though the weapon yearned to be wielded once more, to ring out in thunderous fury. In that moment, the young boy realized he was too small, too gentle, too afraid. He let the cloth fall back over the hammer and fled the armory, vowing never to return alone. Meanwhile, in the halls of power, Cersei Lannister, widow of the late King Robert, gave no thought to the warhammer other than to regard it as a relic of a past she preferred to forget. She had endured Robert's boorish ways and his drunken wrath, and to her, that hammer symbolized his brutish nature. She might have had it melted down if it weren't for the whispers of its potential significance to the realm's history and the fear that such a public act might stir ill omens or provoke whispers of sacrilege. So it remained, locked away in a corner, out of sight and largely out of mind. Yet the realm itself was hardly at peace. The War of the Five Kings raged, and with each new rumor that arrived at King's Landing, Robb Stark winning battles in the Riverlands, Stannis Baratheon proclaiming himself the rightful king at Dragonstone, Renly Baratheon mustering the might of the Reach, tensions rose. Renly, the youngest of Robert's brothers, was known for his charm and the devotion he inspired in his followers. Some wondered if he might ask for the warhammer that had crowned Robert's legacy, but he did not. He bore his own sword, forging a path of bright banners and smiling knights. In truth, the hammer was a heavy burden, both literally and symbolically, tied to the memory of the thunderous warrior king that Renly could never quite emulate. Then there was Stannis, dour and rigid, whose seat was at Dragonstone, cradle of House Targaryen's ancient line. Stannis believed in law and duty above all else, and though he was Robert's rightful heir by strict primogeniture once Joffrey's parentage was called into question, few lords rushed to his banner. Had Stannis demanded the warhammer, claiming it was part of his inheritance, he might have bolstered his image as Robert's successor. But Stannis was never one for symbols of grandeur. He bore Lightbringer, or what he believed to be Lightbringer, a sword proclaimed to be magical by the Red Priestess Melisandre. If there was any lingering power in Robert's hammer, Stannis might have considered it overshadowed by the power of Rhaegar. Or perhaps he secretly feared to wield a relic that had spilled Targaryen blood, uncertain if it carried a hidden curse that would doom him as well. So the hammer waited, silent but not inert. Over the years, the Red Keep's servants began to share quiet stories among themselves. At times they heard a faint humming from the armory, a vibration that rattled the racks of arms near the Warhammer's stand. More superstitious servants left small offerings, a flower, a candle, to appease whatever spirit might dwell within. Others dismissed it as the workings of their anxious minds, surrounded as they were by the intrigues and murders that plagued the castle. But a few swore that on stormy nights, if one crept close enough, one might see sparks dancing around the hammer's head, like tiny forks of lightning. Far across the narrow sea, in exiled circles, some Targaryen loyalists claimed that Robert had cheated fate by using dark sorcery. They claimed that Rhaegar was destined to triumph if not for the monstrous power lurking in Robert's hand. These were the same loyalists who spun rumors that Daenerys Targaryen, last known scion of the dragon line, would one day return with true fire and blood to reclaim the Iron Throne. They vowed that if the hammer still existed, it would be destroyed in dragonflame when House Targaryen rose again. Yet Daenerys, lost to the east, had other concerns. Hatching dragons from petrified eggs, forging alliances, and dreaming of her own path to the throne. The notion of Robert's warhammer, infused with some strange magic, rarely surfaced in her circle of advisors, for they had enough legends of their own to chase. The hammer's story might have ended there, languishing as an artifact, had not a certain curious maester named Eilen quietly delved into the old archives. Eilen was a man of advanced years, stoop-shouldered and pale, who had once studied at the Citadel in Old Town. He had a particular fascination with runic languages and the forging techniques of ancient civilizations. Dedicating his twilight years to unraveling mysteries, he found references to an unnamed blacksmith from the Stormlands whose forging methods involved incantations beneath the light of the moon. The dusty tomes suggested that this blacksmith possessed knowledge older than Valyrian steelcraft, derived from the worship of primal forces in the deep woods. One crisp morning, Eilen requested an audience with Queen Regent Cersei. She granted him a brief hearing, her impatience thinly veiled. He spoke haltingly of the Warhammer's significance, proposing that if it contained even a fraction of the rumored power, it might be harnessed or at least studied to understand any potential threat or advantage. Cersei's green eyes flickered with disinterest. She dismissed the idea, reminding him that the realm was at war and her time was far too precious to be spent indulging old men's fantasies. In her mind, the hammer was a relic of a brute whose memory she would sooner bury than celebrate. Rebuffed yet undeterred, Maester Eilen used what little freedom he had to examine the warhammer himself. He bribed the guards with coin and sweet words of academic curiosity. Late one night, he shuffled into the armory and lit a single candle, holding it close to the weapon. His eyes widened as he traced the shape of the runes on the hammer's head. He recognized some patterns from obscure texts referencing the children of the forest, swirling lines that suggested the old powers of nature. There were also marks reminiscent of certain glyphs used by the first men in their earliest treaties with the children. Eilen gently placed a palm on the cool steel. He murmured a phrase in an ancient tongue, one he had gleaned from crumbling manuscripts, and for a moment he felt the air tighten around him, as if 1,000 tiny needles pricked at his skin. The flame of his candle guttered, nearly snuffed out by a sudden draft or surge of energy. With trembling hands, he drew back, heart pounding against his ribs. He realized that, indeed, something lay dormant within this weapon. But if the hammer was bound to Robert Baratheon's fury, if it was an extension of his spirit, perhaps it now lay in a slumber akin to death, waiting for a worthy hand to awaken it once more. As the maester stood in that chamber, the darkness pressing against the flickering circle of candlelight, he wondered if the day would come when someone strong enough or desperate enough would call upon the old power, whether for good or ill. Time marched on, and the war took many turns. Renly was struck down by a shadow. Stannis was defeated at the Battle of the Blackwater. and Joffrey's cruelty reigned in King's Landing. The Lannisters held power in the capital, forging uneasy alliances, while the North bled. The hammer sat untouched, a silent witness to each shift of power, each betrayal and heartbreak. Men came and went, swords were drawn and sheathed, but no one reached for the warhammer that had once shattered the breastplate of a prince. It remained behind the battered shields, collecting dust and half-forgotten. No one noticed when Brienne of Tarth, wounded and weary from her own battles, was brought to King's Landing as a prisoner. Loyal only to her oaths, she found herself cast into the dungeons by those who mistrusted her. Fortune or misfortune led her to cross paths with Maester Aelin when she was temporarily released for questioning. The old Maester, curious about the woman rumored to be a fearsome warrior, engaged her in a quiet conversation. Brienne's eyes lit up with interest when the hammer was mentioned. She had admired Robert in her youth, seeing in him a gallant warrior king. She had heard the tales of the hammer, of how it rang with thunder. But like so many stories, she suspected it was just that, a story. Still, the idea that Robert's weapon might hold a glimmer of power stirred the knightly devotion in her. She had pledged herself to a cause, to protect others, to keep her word, to uphold a better ideal of knighthood than the realm often witnessed. Alas, her captivity and the labyrinthine politics of King's Landing gave her little chance to see the hammer herself. Soon she was sent away, tasked with impossibilities, leaving behind only a faint impression upon the old Maester. Aelin continued his lonely study, poring over treatises about forging storms into steel. He discovered references to storms harnessed in metal, to the forging of a sword called Stormbringer in the Age of Heroes, though no such sword was widely recognized in modern times. It seemed the concept of binding the wild energy of nature into a weapon had been attempted by many a cunning smith, none successful in replicating the feats of Valyrian steel. But Robert's hammer, if indeed it contained a fraction of that force, was an anomalous triumph achieved through unknown means. Then came a turn of events that would prove decisive for the hammer's fate. With the Lannisters' grip on power faltering, rebellions stirring, and the arrival of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons rumored across the sea, a new wave of chaos swept the realm. King's Landing braced for siege. Queen Cersei, paranoid and desperate, began ordering every available resource to the defense of the city. Old weapons were refurbished. Ballistae were dusted off to potentially repel dragons. In the scramble, a Lannister officer discovered the warhammer. He deemed it an impressive piece of steel, though ironically too large for most men. He ordered it moved to the Red Keep's main arsenal, hoping it might serve as a symbol of defiance against any Targaryen attack. The officer himself, a knight named Ser Olivar, attempted to lift it. Though a strong man, he struggled, barely able to raise the hammer from its stand. He grunted and strained until the veins stood out on his neck. Eventually, he managed to hoist it, but the effort left him panting. He realized that wielding it effectively would be nearly impossible for him. Still, Ser Olivar oversaw its transport under guard to a more prominent display. Soldiers who saw the hammer up close felt a chill in the air, despite the stifling heat of King's Landing in summer. One guardsman, a veteran of old battles, said the runes on the steel head looked like twining snakes or swirling winds. Another soldier claimed to see them glow faintly, but Ser Olivar dismissed such talk, attributing it to nerves and sweaty imaginations. Once in place, the warhammer loomed like a dark promise near the racks of common swords and spears, a silent testament to a time when the realm had bent before a single swing. When the city fell under threat, be it from dragons or marauding armies, one desperate plan after another was concocted. Some suggested placing the warhammer in the hands of the mountain, Ser Rhaegar Clegane, whose terrifying strength was almost unmatched. But others recoiled from the idea. If the hammer did possess hidden might, giving it to a butcher like the mountain could bring calamity rather than salvation. And so the hammer remained, untouched, a topic of uneasy debate. The clashing wills of the queen, her advisors, and the officers in charge meant no one could agree on what to do with the relic. Fear hung like a shroud over the Red Keep, thickening each day as rumors of dragons flying toward Blackwater Bay spread through the streets. One fateful evening, As panic seized the city, Maester Aelin found himself drawn back to the armory. He had learned all he could from the dusty scrolls and half-truths in the library. Now, with everything at stake, he felt compelled to confront the hammer directly. Perhaps he believed that if it truly contained some vestige of the storms, it could be awakened to defend the city. Or perhaps he merely wanted to witness the depths of its mystery before the end came. With a lantern in hand, he slipped past the guards and closed the door behind him. In the flickering glow, the hammer's dark steel seemed to drink in the light. Kneeling beside the massive weapon, the old maester placed both hands on the haft. A hum vibrated through him. He closed his eyes and recited a verse in the old tongue of the first men. A patchwork of syllables gleaned from ancient manuscripts. The air in the armory became charged, still yet crackling with potential. His heartbeat quickened. He tried to rise, to lift the hammer in the name of King's Landing's defense, but it would not budge. Gravity seemed doubled around it, or perhaps around his weary old bones. Sweat beaded on his brow. He gave a short cry, half of frustration, half of awe. He sensed a stirring in the metal, like a living presence. Yet it would not heed him. Whether it was because he lacked the physical strength or because the hammer refused him, he could not say. Suddenly, the door burst open. Ser Olivar entered, face twisted with anger. He saw the maester on his knees, palms pressed against the hammer, chanting in a tongue that sounded profane to his ears. "What are you doing, old man?" he snarled, hand on his sword hilt. "Are you trying to curse us? Summon some demon to tear down the castle?" Aelin stumbled away, palms raised in submission, stammering about hidden knowledge, about harnessing the storms. The knight scoffed, dragging him to his feet. "You're mad," he said. "We have real battles to fight. Keep your sorcery to yourself." He ordered guards to remove the maester, who found himself unceremoniously locked in his chambers under suspicion of treason or madness. No one quite knew which. In the days that followed, King's Landing braced for invasion. Cersei prepared her wildfire traps. Jaime Lannister, returned from distant battles, did what he could to maintain order. In that swirling chaos, nobody spared a thought for the old warhammer. It was rumored that in the final hours, Queen Cersei even considered melting it down to provide more steel for weapons, but the logistics made that idea impractical. So it stayed where it was, in a corner, overshadowed by the more pressing instruments of war. And then the dragons came, great beasts of fire. Daenerys Targaryen took the city, and in the ensuing clash, the old structures of power crumbled. Soldiers bent the knee or died. The Red Keep changed hands amidst the screams of the dying. When the dust settled, the Targaryen banners flew from the ramparts. Daenerys entered the throne room, dragons roaring overhead, to claim the seat that she believed was hers by blood and right. The city, reeling from the onslaught, witnessed a new era dawning. Amidst the looting and chaos that follow any such conquest, the hammer's fate hung in the balance. Targaryen soldiers ransacked the armories, claiming swords, bows, and armor. No one paid special heed to a single warhammer that bore the Baratheon sigil. Most assumed it was just another relic of the previous regime, albeit a large and unwieldy one. A Dothraki warrior even tried to lift it, grinning at the challenge, only to stagger under its weight and toss it aside with a curse. Yet the hammered runes caught the eye of one of Daenerys' advisors, a woman learned in lore, who recognized the swirling patterns from half-remembered stories. She quietly set the hammer aside, ensuring it would not be lost to the flames or the careless disposal that followed. She suspected, perhaps, that it was the very same weapon that had ended the life of Rhaegar Targaryen, though she kept that suspicion to herself for the time being. Even among Targaryen loyalists, the memory of Rhaegar's defeat carried a bitter sting. So the warhammer found its way into a vault beneath the Red Keep, stored alongside other spoils and trophies from the conquest. There it lay in darkness, unregarded by the new regime. Daenerys had much to occupy her mind. Negotiations, rebellions, the burden of ruling a war-torn kingdom. Dragons might be the stuff of legend, but feeding and controlling them proved no simple task. The last thing on her mind was Robert Baratheon's ancient warhammer, rumored to hold a spark of some old, nameless magic. Still, the Targaryen advisor who had put it aside, a slender woman named Delena, made occasional visits to the vault. She would stand before the hammer with a lantern in hand, peering at the runes, pondering what it might mean to the new order. She knew that some Targaryens whispered of curses placed by the gods on those who spilled royal blood. Others believed that the rightful vengeance of House Targaryen could never be undone. She pondered whether the hammer could be twisted to Daenerys's advantage, or at least studied to glean some lost forging technique. But the queen's attention was dominated by larger concerns: quelling uprisings, ensuring food supplies, and rebuilding alliances. Yet even as the realm settled into its uneasy peace under Daenerys's rule, the storms never ceased in the Stormlands. The region remained as wild as ever, battered by coastal winds. Ravens traveled back and forth, carrying news of how a new Storm's End castellan was attempting to restore order to the battered seat of House Baratheon. Rumors trickled in that people there still prayed to the old Storm King, that they believed a day would come when a new champion would arise, carrying the fury of the storms in his weapon to drive out foreign invaders or false kings. So, me even claimed that this champion would reclaim Robert's Warhammer and herald a new age of Stormlord dominance. To the common folk, battered by war and famine, such legends offered a sliver of hope. Delena, ever curious, wondered if returning the hammer to Storm's End might be a gesture of goodwill, an act of bridging the new Targaryen regime with the old Stormlands. But she feared that the local lords might interpret it differently, perhaps rallying around the hammer as a symbol of rebellion against the Dragon Queen. So the weapon remained in the vault, a silent artifact bearing a legacy of blood. As the months passed, Delena's curiosity grew. She gathered scraps of knowledge from other maesters who survived the transition of power, gleaning that Robert's blacksmith, Harbert the Silent, had vanished long ago. She scoured the library for references to forging storms into steel, finding only tantalizing hints in texts so old their pages flaked at the touch. The deeper she looked, the more she sensed that the hammer was a singular anomaly, an echo of a lost art. One passage in particular haunted her. "He who binds the wrath of the sky in iron shall wield a thunder that cannot be denied." It hinted that if the forging was done under a certain constellation, with certain incantations, the resulting weapon would be a conduit for destructive force. But no matter how many times she visited the vault to study the runes, the hammer refused to yield its secrets. Eventually, rumors of a resurgent threat in the north began to consume Daenerys's attention. Though the Night King had been defeated in one telling of the tales, new horrors and new conflicts always seemed to arise. Meanwhile, the question of how to unify the Seven Kingdoms remained fraught with tension. Delena, sensing an opportunity, proposed a mission to Storm's End under the guise of diplomatic outreach. She intended to bring the hammer with her, carefully packed, and observe how the local lords reacted. Perhaps in the Stormlands, under the raging skies that had witnessed its creation, the Warhammer would reveal its nature. Daenerys, occupied with the demands of her court, granted the request without much scrutiny. Thus, on a rainy morning, a small caravan departed King's Landing, heading south for Storm's End. Delena rode in a covered wagon alongside a crate that held the hammer, its corners padded with cloth. She traveled with a handful of guards, none of whom knew the specific significance of the cargo they bore. The road was long and treacherous, with the once well-tended highways now riddled with potholes and bandit dens. As the caravan pressed on, the skies darkened each day. Rain pounded the canvas tops. Thunder rolled across the heavens as if in distant conversation with the steel secreted in the crate. Delena could not help feeling an undercurrent of anticipation, as though the storms themselves sensed the hammer's journey back to its birthplace. Yet this was no triumphant return. Upon reaching the Stormlands, they found villages ravaged by raiders, the crops drowned by relentless rainfall. The local populace was weary, suspicious of any from King's Landing, especially those allied with House Targaryen. Delena, ever the diplomat, offered assurances that the crown sought to aid them, that she carried something precious tied to their heritage. Most folk merely shrugged or spat at the mention of kings and queens. It would take more than words to mend the wounds inflicted by years of war. After many days, the towering walls of Storm's End emerged from sheets of rain. The fortress stood defiant against the sea's fury, as it always had. Delaena and her retinue were granted entry, but the mood among the castle's garrison and stewards was tense. The castellan, a stern-faced man named Lord Estermont, greeted them with politeness laced with caution. Delaena revealed the warhammer, still in the crate, but uncovered for the castellan's inspection. His breath caught in his throat when he recognized it. "By the gods!" he whispered, reaching out to run his fingers over the runes. "Robert's hammer. I never thought to see it again." Delaena explained that she brought it to Storm's End to honor the memory of House Baratheon, hoping to spark unity and cooperation. She watched the castellan's reaction carefully. A range of emotions flickered across his weathered face. Pride, sorrow, a longing for the old days when Robert's presence had filled these halls with a boisterous life. Finally, he nodded. "It belongs here," he murmured. "This is its home." The castellan commanded a servant to carry the hammer inside. The young man strained under its weight, stumbling through the corridors until he arrived at the great hall. There, before the ancient seat of the Durandons and Baratheons, the hammer was placed upon a sturdy oaken table. Rain pattered against the arrow-slit windows, and lightning occasionally flashed, illuminating the hall in stark brilliance. In those moments, the runes on the hammer's head appeared to shimmer, as though awakened by the thunder outside. The gathered knights and retainers stared, some in reverent silence, others in wary fascination. Delaena took note of every reaction. The rumors might still hold true, that the hammer had some bond with the storms raging beyond these walls. She wondered if Robert's spirit, or something older and more primal, lingered in the steel, resonating with the thunder that had once been his ally. The castellan announced that the hammer would remain in the Great Hall as a symbol of House Baratheon's enduring legacy, a reminder of the Storm King who had taken the Iron Throne by force. As for Delaena, she was given chambers to stay the night, while discussions began about forging a cooperative relationship with the Targaryen regime. She took note of the subtle shift in atmosphere. If these negotiations went well, perhaps the Stormlands would solidify their loyalty to Daenerys. If not, the presence of the hammer could just as easily embolden rebellious hearts. Late that night, long after the banquet had ended and the guests had retired, Delaena felt restless. She slipped out of her chambers and made her way to the great hall, guided by flickering torches in sconces along the walls. She found it empty but for a single guard dozing at his post. The warhammer lay upon the oaken table, bathed in the pale moonlight streaming through the high windows. Outside, the storm raged, shaking the fortress with each peal of thunder. Drawing closer, Delaena felt a static tingle across her skin. Her hair stood on end. It was as if the air around the hammer vibrated with each lightning strike. She pressed her hand to the haft, just as Maester Aelin had done in the Red Keep. This time, she felt a deeper resonance, almost like a pulse beating in tandem with the storm outside. Her breath caught as she recalled the old text. "He who binds the wrath of the sky in iron shall wield a thunder that cannot be denied." She felt unsteady, her heart pounding with unspoken possibility. In her mind's eye, she saw an image of Robert, tall and broad, forging a path through the chaos of battle, each swing of his hammer fueled by a fury that could not be contained. She wondered if, in that moment, the storm recognized a lost child returning home. But she was no warrior. The hammer was too heavy, too bound to a lineage that was not hers. She lifted her hand away, stepping back. The storm's fury continued unabated, wind howling around the turrets of Storm's End. She glanced up at the thunder-shaken rafters, half expecting the roof to split open. A strange sense of destiny buzzed in her thoughts. Would the rightful heir of House Baratheon ever return to claim this relic, channel its power, and remind the realm of why the stag had once been crowned king? At dawn, the storm receded, leaving mist and drizzle in its wake. Delaena found Lord Estermont and informed him that she would remain for a time to discuss matters of governance and aid. The castellan seemed amenable, though his eyes wandered often to the hammer in the great hall, as if compelled by a memory of his youth. Whispers spread among the knights and servants that perhaps the spirit of Robert Baratheon walked the corridors again, vexed by the new order or waiting to bestow his blessing on a worthy champion. Superstitions flared, and some men took to leaving small offerings near the table. An antler from a stag, a coin minted with Robert's visage, a scrap of parchment bearing old words of adulation. Delaena observed these offerings with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. She recognized a nascent cult of personality forming around the memory of Robert and his enchanted hammer. In the following weeks, the negotiations between Storm's End and Queen Daenerys's representatives took shape. Plans were made for rebuilding the Stormlands, securing trade routes, and providing relief to war-weary villages. Delaena assisted, carefully balancing Targaryen interests with the pride of House Baratheon's vassals. All the while, the hammer sat in the great hall, a silent sentinel. Visitors to Storm's End were shown the relic, and more than one old knight knelt before it with tears in his eyes, remembering the day Robert rode out to battle the Targaryens and came back a king. A few brash young men, hoping to prove themselves, attempted to lift the hammer in front of an audience. Most could barely move it off the table. One or two managed to raise it to their shoulder, only to drop it quickly, breathless from the effort. Each failure seemed to feed the legend that only Robert Baratheon or a similarly blessed warrior could truly wield that thunderous weight. Yet power has a way of tempting the ambitious. Certain knights, eager to carve their names into the annals of history, began to spin notions of how they might claim the hammer and ride forth to unite the scattered remnants of the realm. They whispered in corners, eyeing the warhammer like a holy grail. Some believed it could grant them Robert's unstoppable might, that a single swing could quell any foe. Lord Estermont, sensing such undercurrents, grew vigilant, posting additional guards in the great hall. He wanted no opportunist to steal the relic and spark a rebellion, or worse, anger the new queen. Delaena, perceiving the tension, cautioned him that the hammer was indeed a potent symbol and must be handled with care. Meanwhile, ravens flew back and forth between Storm's End and King's Landing, carrying updates on the negotiations. Daenerys, far more focused on threats from the north or potential dissent in the Reach, granted Delaena the latitude to conclude matters as she saw fit. A sense of precarious peace settled over the fortress. Outside, storms continued to batter the coasts with typical ferocity, but within those walls, life took on a fragile routine. It was into this routine that the rumor of a hidden heir emerged, a rumor that shook the castle. Someone claimed that Gendry, a rumored bastard son of Robert Baratheon, had been spotted in the region, forging steel for a local blacksmith. The gossip flitted through the courtyard and feast hall like wildfire. Could he be the rightful one to lift Robert's hammer? Would House Baratheon rise again under an unacknowledged son? Delaena raised a cautious eyebrow at the talk. Bastards had little claim, yet in a land so battered by war, such details often mattered less than the hearts of the people and the potency of a legend. If Gendry truly was Robert's blood, if he could claim the hammer, might the common folk flock to him? So the question lingered in the air. Did the hammer indeed hold a magic that only Robert's kin could unleash? Or was it still just a formidable chunk of steel, albeit shrouded in superstition? The potential answers were as volatile as the storms themselves. Delaena could not dismiss the notion that blood might matter when it came to ancient forging rituals, that the runes might respond to lineage, just as Valyrian steel sometimes bonded with certain families across generations. If Gendry were to come, if he were to lay his hands upon the weapon, it might either remain inert or crackle with life. The realm might yet see another demonstration of unstoppable force. Lord Estermont, for his part, grew uneasy about the swirling speculation. He had no desire for more conflict, having seen too many men die in the name of kings. Yet a kernel of curiosity took root in him. He was loyal to House Baratheon, and a bastard was still a Baratheon by blood. If Gendry appeared at the castle gates, how could he be turned away? Would the memory of Robert demand that this boy at least be heard, allowed a chance to prove himself? The Castellan fretted over what Daenerys would think if he extended such courtesy. He shared these fears with Delaena, who in turn weighed the political ramifications. A single bastard could threaten the entire foundation of the Queen's rule if the people rallied around him. Thus did the Warhammer remain at the heart of a quiet storm brewing inside Storm's End. Fate, the old gods, or chance might bring Gendry to that table, might test his mettle against the steel that felled Rhaegar Targaryen. Or the boy might never appear, and the hammer might lie dormant until all who remembered Robert Baratheon had passed from this world. Delaena wondered if the weapon would eventually become just another dusty relic of the past, its alleged magic fading into obscurity, overshadowed by new wars and new legends. But she sensed that the story was not yet done. The storms that lashed the fortress walls seemed too persistent, their thunder too resonant, as though echoing a promise from beyond time. One evening, long after the castle had quieted down, Delaena made her way to the great hall once again. She found it empty save for a single guttering torch. The hammer rested upon the oaken table, gleaming darkly in the half-light. She drew closer, compelled by the intangible pull she had felt ever since the day she set eyes upon it in King's Landing. Gently, she placed both hands on the haft. She closed her eyes, summoning courage. She felt the hum, the faint vibration in the metal. In her mind, she pictured lightning striking the ramparts, pictured Robert's triumphant roar as he shattered Rhaegar's breastplate. A flush of energy, or perhaps pure imagination, coursed through her veins. She tried once more to lift the hammer. Her muscles strained, her knuckles went white, but it barely rose an inch before she had to set it down again. It was as though it weighed more than mere steel, as though it carried the burden of the storms themselves. Letting out a sharp breath, Delaena slumped against the table, sweat beading on her forehead. In that moment, she felt a sudden sense of sorrow, as though the weapon mourned the loss of its rightful wielder. The candle flame danced in a draught, casting fleeting shadows across the runes etched into the hammer's head. She could almost imagine them shifting, forming an expression of longing or regret. In the quiet that followed, Delaena heard the distant boom of thunder. She listened, half expecting it to speak in some ancient tongue. Instead, it was just thunder, a reminder of the Stormland's perpetual war with the skies. And yet she could not shake the feeling that somewhere out there, destiny stirred. Maybe Gendry wandered the coasts, uncertain of his place in a realm that had been torn apart by men in pursuit of crowns. Maybe he would find his way here, called by the intangible echo of his father's weapon. Or maybe another champion would rise, forging a claim that transcended bloodlines. After all, the storms themselves belonged to no one family, and if the forging had tied the hammer's power to that wild force, any with the strength and spirit might unleash it. Yet for now, the hammer remained silent. Delaena straightened, composing herself, and left the hall, determined to rest. She told herself the realm was weary of violence, that the age of warhammers and dragons needed to give way to diplomacy and reconstruction. But she could not fully banish the undercurrent of hope or fear that the future might prove otherwise. Legends had a way of rearing up when least expected, and the Seven Kingdoms were full of dreamers seeking wonders or would-be conquerors seeking weapons to solidify their claims. And so the question endured, carried on the breath of rumor and the hush of halls. If Robert Baratheon's hammer was indeed imbued with a magical property, some primal storm harnessed within steel, who would be the next to wield it? Could it, in the hands of a rightful heir or a fated champion, once again shape the destiny of the realm? Or was its legend merely a tapestry of tall tales woven around a single moment of triumph on a bloody riverbank? Each new generation would ask, and the hammer would await an answer in silence. The only sound accompanying it was the ceaseless battering of rain and wind upon the fortress walls, as if the storms themselves remembered the forging and the fury of the man who had once seized a kingdom with a single thunderous blow.